Mm-hmm.
in the U.S., but affirmative action, if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but isn't people that are in favor of affirmative action, wouldn't they potentially argue that it's a mechanism to ensure more economic mobility for certain...
Right, like if you are an ethnic group that benefits from affirmative action in that you get to go to universities that maybe you wouldn't have gotten to go to without the benefit of a diversity positive policy, right? So maybe you got into a university that brought you in and accepted you because they value diversity and wanted you to come. Right, so then, so that would mean, broadly speaking, that any ethnic group given that help would mean those students would end up at more exclusive educational institutions, right? So the question is, does attending an exclusive educational institution produce income inequality gains? I don't know what the data is on that.
Right.
I would say, right, there are consequences to that policy. I mean positive, but there's some negative ones. For example, you know for sure that at any university, at any level, right, it is very hard to, for whatever reason, I think it has to do with how math is taught, but like math, physics, no matter what, it's the top, 10% of students that actually manage to complete those kinds of degrees. And again, it's kind of silly, right? Because if you were bottom tier at Harvard, you probably would be top tier at Middle Tennessee State, right? But if you're at Harvard, you can't hack it at math. But if you're at Middle Tennessee State, you should be able to, but that's not how it works, right? It's sort of like you just, no matter where you are, you have to be in the top. So it's nothing inherently with math. It's just for whatever reason the way math is taught. Regular, if you're a middle of the road college student, it's not going to work wherever you are, even though you would have been the top somewhere else, right? And that means inherently, right, if I'm in an affirmative action supported group, I'm automatically getting put in places where STEM isn't really going to work for me, right? Because relative to my peers, I have, right, I'm not in the top 10% on the kind of stuff, like the regular stuff, right? And then we see shortages of minorities in the STEM field. So it's sort of like it can create...
The system perpetuates itself.
Right. So, right, to some degree, it would almost be like, okay, well, yeah, you can get into Harvard, but you should go to Michigan and be in the STEM field, and you'll kill it because you'll be better than everybody because you're brilliant, and then you can go on to grad school and do, it's sort of, it's not necessarily, to me, obviously good to put people in universities where you're just barely got in, right? I mean, maybe, right? There's lots of networking opportunities. There's stuff, there's value there, right? But it's not unambiguously good. So, but I think you're right about the rationale, right? That's why we do it. It's like, you basically the universe gave you a tough shake. We're trying to figure out how to fix generations of racism and abuse and outright theft, and right. We want to have policies that acknowledge all of these terrible things. So. And that's, a good... also I think it's beneficial. Diversity has value in and of itself, right? But... yeah, it's also kind of a zero-sum game, right? In the sense that if everybody has these policies, then nobody ends up any more diverse than they would have. Everything just shifts, right? So it's like, and if you are managing to collect more minority students than other universities, well, then somebody else isn't getting them, right? Now, unless you're managing, so it's sort of like if you're managing to increase the pool of minority applicants, then you're actually doing something to contribute to diversity rather than just stealing it from other places, right? And there's for example, we think about here at Viterbo, we have where the Mathy is a team up with the Boys and Girls Club, and so we have kids right from that neighborhood are on campus all the time, right? Now, I have no idea whether that's causal or not, but you think, gosh, if you want to get minority students to apply for college, to go to college, maybe having them be familiar with college from childhood would probably be a good thing, right? So that's different than just cutting checks, right? I think that does, right? I mean, those are different kinds of activities, even though they both may generate diversity ultimately.
Right. Exposure to other ways of getting income, other ways of growing yourself should exponentially offer value later on in your life because you've been exposed to that. Yeah, what's in there?
Yeah, no, maybe so. My brother-in-law, his son, foster son, is convinced that anyone with any kind of money is a YouTuber, right? So if he sees an Alfa Romero on the street, that must be a YouTuber. Like, no, your typical person with income to buy a nice car is not a YouTuber. But how would you know, right? If you have if fancy cars are just some mystical thing that some people end up with somehow, apparently the only way he knows of at this point in his life is that YouTube people make money. So he doesn't know that medicine pays or that you could be a captain of industry or any of the other sort of options you have to afford a Tesla. All he knows about is YouTube. Right, so there's value to and I mean, to be honest, I was the same when I was 18, 19. I assumed that, right, the path to financial stability and success in life was a lot of traditional education, like an MBA or whatever, professional degree. So the first time I did taxes for a heavy equipment operator for a frac sand mine was pretty shocking. Wow, okay. So, I mean, it was like an $80,000 job running those machines. No one should put me in charge of one of those. I could do $1 million of damage to a frac sand mine really fast with my attention to detail. But yeah, it was just total, right? I just, this is like you have a standard middle class childhood. You bump into what you bump into when you get blind to a lot of things. So, yeah, so I think, cross pollination does a lot. Now that's a long way from the Federal Reserve, but short way from what you're talking about. So let's talk about it. So we have it, right, here we go. Now, the Federal Reserve isn't the first central bank in the United States. Anybody know the first central bank? If you're a Broadway fan, you might know. Comes up.
Is it in Hamilton?
Yep, for sure. Right?
I never seen it.
Yeah. So Alexander Hamilton was very instrumental in the founding of the Bank of the United States, and it was dismantled by Andrew Jackson. I can't decide if so he's on the money, right? He's on the money, and I can't decide if it's like if they're honoring him or just messing with his memory, right? Because he got rid of the central bank, and now he's like the poster child for a Federal Reserve Bank note. I forget if they got rid of him, though. I know Harriet Tubman is coming, I think, so I forgot who they ditched for her. But anyway, so that was the original central bank was the Bank of the United States, but currently it's Federal Reserve, founded in 1913. Partially in response to the banking panic of 1907. If you go back to the history of the United States, banking panics happen with, like regularity. It was like every 12 years or so, we'd have a banking panic. And it would be, for some of these, it was like 30% of the banks would fail. Stuff like that. I have a hobby of hating on Andrew Jackson, so it's all like, we talk about executive orders. Did I mention Andrew Jackson executive orders yet? So I bring it up a lot. So they had, they were doing land sales, right? So the federal government had a bunch of land that they, either conquered or traded for or purchased or did with treaties or whatever. There's a bunch of land all over in the, Mid-South, Midwest, right, kind of area. And people could buy it, right? They'd buy it to settle on, right? And and they were using state currency. So at the time they didn't really have a federal currency. They used Wisconsin dollars or Illinois dollars or whatever. And President Jackson got sick of getting these state currencies for federal land, which were then, they would say $1 on it, but it wasn't actually worth $1. It was worth something less. And he just thought that was, just like ridiculous. And so he just did an executive order. All land sales have to be done with specie. It was like literally you have to pay silver or gold to get land from the federal government. Well, that naturally decreased demand for these state currencies by a lot because people were using them to do these land sales. So suddenly there's like a lot less demand for these state currencies than there used to be, which caused them to drop in value, right? But they were used as reserves in the banking system, right? I'm a bank, I got a whole bunch of money sitting in the vaults to back the deposits that's now dropped in value, and suddenly I'm bankrupt, and boom, right? So stroke of the pen, effectively demolished 30% of the banking system. Just not really thinking things through, I think, or having bad advisors, or who knows, right? But it was just like, whatever, y'all gotta pay gold, boom, right? Banking panic like crazy.
Right. Well, Harriet Tubman's gonna replace him on the $20.
Oh, good. Get out. Yeah, I think it was supposed to be Hamilton at first. I was like,
And then they
oh
switched
man,
that
you can't leave Jackson in and take.
Yeah.
I mean, Trail of Tears, right? Are you kidding me? It's crazy. And actually, Congress banned him from doing that. By the way, I don't know if you know that. Congress passed a law that says, basically, no Trail of Tears, don't do it. And he's like, whatever, get out. Everybody died, But it's terrible. He was on the money. Soapbox. Well, anyway, so we have new central bank as of 1913. All right, so talk to me. What do central banks do? Because they're all over the planet. And I'm going to do a general picture. What does the central bank do? There's a laundry list of stuff. No idea.
Borrow and bank money on behalf of the federal government.
Okay, that is true. So the Federal Reserve is like the Wells Fargo of the federal government, right? So if I am Logistics Health and I land an 8-year contract, do all of the immunizations for every American serviceman or whatever, and that's a $19 billion contract, my $19 billion check is going to be handled by the Federal Reserve. So yeah, well, right? So the banking, they do the banking for the federal government. That's, part of what they do. Probably not the most important thing, but they definitely do it.
So do they store money and all like that? Do they have physical reserves, like I said, gold that they're storing? I know that standard doesn't exist anymore.
Right. No, I think, right, so there are gold reserves, and they do have, right, some. Again, like you say, we don't really back our currency with any of that, but we still have it somewhere. And then, but the separate thing you said, which is true, was do they store money? And the answer historically was no, but recently is very much yes. So we'll get into that, sort of a little bit of mission drift for the Fed, but at least historically, I guess the Federal Reserve would have deposits from federal agencies or something for them to write checks out of, right? So they would have a little bit of deposit stuff, but that wasn't really major thing historically. Well, that's changed.
They establish and manage monetary policy for the federal government.
Yes. So establish and manage monetary policy, and I would say even maybe bigger, which subsumes that, is right. The currency itself, right, is a creation of the Federal Reserve, right? So if you pull a dollar bill out, right, it says a Federal Reserve note, right? So they are the creator and monitor and manager of our currency. I guess the mint, which operates outside the Fed, makes coins, but it's really in practice the Federal Reserve notes are their creation, and then right, and like as you say, they are the managers of monetary policy, which affects the value of those notes or of the currency in general. Okay, so that's their major and most important function, is to basically, create the dollar and then manage it.
So stability.
That's the charge, right? Now, they can destabilize too. They have the power to. I mean, but their mission is to keep things running.
That's happened in countries, right, where they just print.
Yep. And so in the U.S. we have a separate system, right? So we have a private central bank. So if the federal government said we want you to print, they can tell them to take a hike, and they're not really beholden to the Congress to do it. But there's some workarounds we'll get into a little bit. But at least in the United States, the Congress can't directly tell the Federal Reserve to debase the currency and print a lot. But that's definitely happened other places, right? So yeah. Right? Independent, don't have to be, the decisions are independent. Okay, so let's talk about how the Federal Reserve maintains the stability of the currency, right? So let's say that there's a global financial panic, right? And lots of countries' economies are collapsing. We're like mostly fine. Definitely better than the rest of the planet in this imaginary scenario, right? So the whole world is kind of panicking, and the global economy is in a really bad spot. Okay, what does that mean for the U.S. dollar? What would that do, do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say it would probably go up because a lot of other places around it are destabilized. The dollar would still be where people want
Money will
to
start pouring into our economy.
Yeah. And let's get really specific, because pouring into our economy is true, but we can actually do better than that in terms of what happens. So if I have investable assets, or let's say I am from the Czech Republic, right? And I have some wealth, not a ton, but I have some, and I have invested broadly throughout Europe. And Europe is taking a dive, and things look really dicey. I'm getting spooked, right? Mm-hmm. So what do? I pull my money out of my, my Slovak stocks and my German stocks and my Spanish stocks and my Swiss savings. Right now, I've got a bunch of money, and I pull it out, and then right, I'm going to send it to America. So how do I send it to America? Okay, so a couple things, right? So you can buy assets in the United States for sure. So real estate, 100%, you can do that, right? It has, right? In particular, we see this a lot in Canada. Quebec sets its own immigration policy. Weird but true. They have an investor permanent residency status. It's like if you invest $1.2 million, you can become a Canadian permanent resident of Quebec, but you don't have to stay in Quebec, right? So what's happened is that Chinese nationals have done the $1.2 million investment in Canada, which often it was real estate, right? So they invest in Canadian real estate in order to emigrate permanent residency status to Quebec, but they don't live in Quebec because that's too from China, so they go to British Columbia. So British Columbia has no control over this immigration policy, and yet they have a whole bunch of Chinese nationals flowing into Vancouver, right? And driving up real estate prices like crazy, right? So 100%, right? You can buy assets in the economy in question, or right. So if we're not buying real estate, what else could we get? If these are all financial assets, so okay, American stocks, also American bonds, right? In particular, government debt. So those are all options, but one of the options is buying American federal government bonds, right? So the Treasury borrows they borrow money $1,000 at a time to fund the deficits that they're doing, right? So there's lots of $1,000 loans floating around all over the planet. Everybody wants those, right? So the $1,000 loans are getting bought up like crazy. What does that do to interest rates? Think about, right? If I'm buying the loans, what's going to happen to the prices? Huge demand for the loans. Prices go
Prices go up.
up. And if the prices go up, but the payments are the same, what does that do to the returns?
Prices go up, payments are the same, then you're not buying as many, value meals.
Correct, right? Your $1,000 loan that buys you 10 Big Macs is now $1,500, but you still only get 10 Big Macs, right? So that's a lower return, right? So the long-term interest rates would fall in response to the flight of capital back to the U.S. Okay, and short-term potentially too, right? Because they're maybe investing across the maturity spectrum.
But $1,000 bond is always $1,000, right?
No,
People pay a premium for a,
correct.
why would you pay a premium?
Oh, great question.
Oh, because you're buying it for the interest rate posted, the particular rate on that particular vehicle.
Yep.
So the rates on different vehicles, okay.
Yep. Yeah. So, and really, what happens, right? It's a 6% bond in a 3% world.
Right.
So you'll pay,
Right.
almost $2,000 for it. If it's long enough. So, right now I'm the Federal Reserve. Think about this, though, right? I'm the Federal Reserve, right? And I like things to be smooth. What's happening to my world? What have we just described? What are some things that are suddenly changing?
Interest rate.
Interest rates are going down, remember, right? Prices are up, rates are down, so interest rates are down, right? The long term, what's happening to our currency? It's worth more, right? Yes, the American dollar is strong. Suddenly, right? So in terms of stability, that's a problem because so how is strong dollar? Who are the winners and losers for strong dollar? It's not all sunshine and rainbows, right? Who in America hates it when the dollar is really strong?
Well, any company that, has overseas assets, but
Yeah, right. Literally any company with foreign customers gets hosed because, right, you paid your consultant $80 to generate the $100 report to send to the customer in Kuala Lumpur. Only now it's triple the price from their perspective, and they can't anymore, and they canceled the contract, right? So you're losing deals left and right. You're discounting left and right to try to stay in the game. It's just bad, right? So any American company with international customers with American cost structures is in trouble instantly, right? Okay, now how many American companies have international customers and American workforce, at least partially? Like, so many. It's like the entire economy, right? Just about. So sudden price appreciation in the dollar is hugely disruptive for companies trying to sell abroad. Now, who wins, right? It can't all be bad.
Wouldn't it be a good time to invest abroad or something? Because the dollar's more valuable if you're buying one.
Yes, so if you're an American with dollar-denominated assets that you can then sell and purchase abroad, you're buying them on fire. So this is like, right, the world is collapsing. So this gets complicated, but you're right. In general, investable assets. There's another the big major group that benefits a lot, right? If I am a purchaser of foreign stuff of any sort, right now suddenly my dollars buy a lot more stuff than they used to. So let's say, right, so my licensing deal with a Chinese intellectual property patent portfolio or something is now cheaper if they wanted payment in local currency. Right, our world gets affected a lot because, right, we probably shop at Walmart. Most of the stuff in Walmart is made in China or somewhere thereabouts, and so suddenly that's all cheaper. You may not see that marked out right away, but in fact, right, if the goal is stability, what we're talking about is not stability, right? That's like the opposite of stability. It's like chaos, okay? So if I'm the Federal Reserve, what can I do to solve this situation? Right? The dollar has suddenly massively appreciated relative to other currencies. So what do I want to do?
Raise interest rates.
So let's think about that. If I raise interest rates, what's that going to do? If interest rates go up, is that going to make investing in American debt more attractive or less attractive?
Well, it would be
The cost of money would be more.
Be more attractive, right? Borrowing is less attractive, but lending is more, right? More money would flow to the U.S. to chase the now even higher interest rates, right? That would drive up demand for assets, American denominated assets, right? That would actually make the currency go up even higher. So right idea, we just have to, instead of raising interest rates, we want to lower them, right? So if we lower them, now American bonds are paying terrible interest. So the international investment community says, well, I'm going to buy them anyway because I'm worried about everything's going to burn, but maybe not quite as much as I was going to, right? So it's sort of like, even though now interest rates are terrible, we're still going to go there because America is like safe. But without lowering the rates, it would have been really a huge flood, right? So
Isn't to some degree, it just feels like monopoly money. Like, 'cause it doesn't feel like they don't change the price of a Big Mac that quickly, do they?
Yes, right, and in the following sense, right? So this is important. This is where all these international monetary things get goofy, right? For you and me, right? We make our money in dollars. We go to McDonald's and spend dollars. So currency fluctuations of the dollar don't affect us because, in a way, we're doing this, right? Our income is suddenly worth a lot more, and prices are suddenly a lot higher, and we don't see it.
Right.
But, right, if you left the country, you would see it. Right, if the dollar doubled in value and you went to Panama, you'd be like, what am I doing buying Big Macs? Right? I'm throwing money at these American businesses. I shouldn't be giving them any money. It's too expensive, right? Down in Panama, everything's a nickel, right? Or if the dollar drops in half and you go, you're like, oh shoot, I really should be buying more American products. They're so cheap, right? So we don't see it because we live in the bubble where we're isolated from these changes, but they're actually happening, right? Outside of the U.S., opportunities are appearing and disappearing constantly. We just don't see it because we don't use them.
Right. So I'm going to travel to Great Britain, and the pound has gone from $1.38 to $1.25, right? So it's more favorable to the U.S. dollar to travel there now. But the price when I'm there, I'm still going to pay $10 for a Big Mac. So during, you know what I mean? They haven't, like, McDonald's doesn't change the price of that Big Mac.
Right.
During the time it went from $1.38 to the time it went from to $1.25, I'm still going to pay $10 for my Big Mac.
Right, so businesses so McDonald's is not making as much money.
No, I would think about, this will be a different, right? Think about it this way, right? That Big Mac the menu price is going to be in pounds, right? And McDonald's does not change that price in pounds to deal with international currency fluctuations, right? So the fact that the pound dropped means, in effect, for you just got a 10% off coupon on that Big Mac.
So it's like the arbitrage between the two is what I say. It's the discount.
Yes.
So yeah. Okay.
And when it goes the other way, suddenly you have a huge penalty, right? Now, that doesn't address the fact that this stuff is just super expensive all over Europe. So it's like 10% off of crazy, but it's still 10% off. Or it would have been
And that's
even
what I was
worse.
thinking, because they're not adjusting their pricing that frequently, but the issue is the discount. It's my dollar gets me more.
Yes.
But if they're buying all of their product from outside of Britain.
Right,
Yeah,
eventually.
no, right. If
Eventually
all
they'll
of the
have
Big
to
Mac
increase.
ingredients come from the United States,
Right.
and those companies demand dollars in payment, well, they may have to push higher prices on British Big Mac consumers, right? The reality is that's not how it works. That lettuce is not, I mean, the lettuce might be American lettuce, but, you know, some of that stuff is going to be local or come from somewhere else in the EU.
The EU requires a certain percentage of EU product.
So, yep, there we go. Yeah, so we don't see it, but those prices change massively, right? So again, if we're looking for stability, which we are often, a sudden appreciation of the dollar is bad in a lot of ways, and that it's not stable. And so a quick drop in the interest rate domestically would be a counteracting force, discouraging international investment in the United States, tamping down the price appreciation of the dollar, and keeping things more stable, right? So what it might do, right, is if I'm an American export firm, I may say, wow, the writing's on the wall. The Fed had to do a whole bunch of crazy stuff to keep me in business. Maybe I need to think about changing what I'm doing, right? Maybe I need to back off some of my export markets or change into a lower quality regime so that other people can afford, right? But the idea is to give American businesses time to react and adjust to the new economic realities, right? So if we just let stuff go nuts, it's really hard for businesses to move as quickly as monetary policy can move. So, and that's what we see, right? In the middle, like if there's a recession cooking and it's looking really bad, the Fed will drop interest rates. Because the rest of the planet is too, and if we don't follow what they're doing, our currency is going to shoot through the roof and cause a whole bunch of
Are we in
chaos.
like one of the longest stretches right now of not having any recession? I mean, it's been a constant.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting on
We're in
a...
some really long recession, lack of recession time frame, but interest rates are also just super low. Like how much lower?
They're
can
not.
you
Interest
go?
rates are high, actually. Kind of.
Now?
Yeah. Well, right. Now, so we'll get into this, right? So the short-term rate sat at 0 for like 7 years, right? I mean, we were at 0.01% on a 1 month CD or something. Those rates are now 2.25, right? It might even be 2.5. So compared to at least the last decade, we have really high short-term rates.
It feels like such a tight margin, you know?
Right. I mean, it's weird, right? Especially having, I mean, I didn't live, I was alive in the 80s, right? But, I mean, we had inflation in the 12%, and so interest rates were like 15, and so 2.5, it's hard to talk about 2.5 being a high rate. But in real terms, it actually is quite high. I mean, I've read an economic paper, like, I'm just basically saying real interest rates are higher than they've been in a long, long time for the short term. Now, long-term ones are low. So so this kind of depends which part of the interest rate world you're talking about. But yes, to some degree, there are parts, at least, of the term structure, we call it, that are really low right now. And it is also true, yes, that it's been a long time, in terms of the historical rhythm of recessions, it's been a long time since we've had one. Longer than normal. But the last one was also really bad. So it kind of, right, that sometimes that might matter, who knows?
So in question of the news, sometimes they talk about like the rate, the Fed changing the rate. Is that the short-term rate that you're talking about?
Absolutely, yeah. So let's get into the exact detail about that, because the mechanism of that is really interesting. So what they're talking about when they say, there's a lot of detail here, and it actually matters because it's a little bit wacky. So what they're talking about is they'll announce a target window for the Fed funds rate. So they're not saying an interest rate. They're saying we hope that the Fed funds rate, which is market determined actually by lending and borrowing between banks for overnight lending. So the Fed funds are overnight funds, and the idea is
The daily, like a daily.
daily, like it's literally just for overnight only. And often, and then historically it was, right, banks are required to keep a certain amount of reserves on hand to be safe, right? And so if you were behind, you would borrow from banks who were ahead so that everybody was exactly at the limit, because that money was just like you didn't get to invest it, so it was an opportunity cost of being a bank. And so you didn't want to have extra stuff, so you would lend it out if you could, and you would borrow it if you had to, and everybody sort of floated around zero. So the Fed funds market was where that overnight lending happened, and that was all market, right? So they would lend to each other, but the Federal Reserve would announce at their meeting, right, their monthly meeting, they would come out and say, well, we think the Fed funds rate should be somewhere between 0.0% and 0.25%. They would like announce a window. But that implicitly announced an interest rate, because it meant that they were going to enter into the market and do open market transactions. They would lend or borrow Fed funds to make it sit in the window. Does that make sense? Right? So it could be, okay, sorry. So if the Federal Reserve announces we want interest rates to be between these goalposts, right? Well, other entities could do whatever they want, but let's say the interest rates drift out of that window. Well, that means interest rates are high, prices are too low, right? Prices are too low, rates are high. So the Federal Reserve could start buying those overnight loans, right? Borrowing in that Fed funds market, and that would drive up prices, drive down interest rates, or lending, I guess, in that case, and move it back to where it belongs, right? So basically, they have the power via open market transactions, like going into those markets and lending and borrowing, to move it where they want it. And so kind of all they have to do is say, this is what we want, and everybody believes that's what's going to happen because they have the power to make it happen. Right? So they kind of don't even have to do it. They just have to say, well, we're going to do it. And everyone goes, oh, okay, that's the new thing. When you look, it just is like, they'll announce a new window and rates go, bloop, like stair step. So yeah, and that matters, right? Because like you say in the news, they'll say, oh, the Fed announced a rate cut. That means that they've adjusted the window that they're targeting for the Fed funds rate. But the actual Fed funds will wiggle around inside that little window. But they'll wiggle around in the middle, and then they'll announce a new window, and it'll jump and wiggle around in that window. So they kind of basically just set it, even though they don't. Exactly. And that matters because, even for longer term rates, because, of course, I could borrow at the Fed funds over and over and over again over a long period, or I could borrow for a long period all at once, right? So I could get a long-term loan or lots of little short-term loans. So if the little short-term loans get lower, that should ultimately make the long-term one lower as well, because, right, if I have to choose between one or the other, if this one suddenly got bad, well, that would make me want this one, which would make it go down too. See how that is? Right? It's just supply and demand, right? If this is suddenly a terrible place because I made it terrible because I said in my meeting, the other stuff is now going to get better, which is going to make it worse. Like as people pile into it, it goes down. Okay, so when the Fed announces a rate change, they're talking about the Fed funds rate, and they're actually talking about the window, which is actually just for overnight lending between banks. Okay. The grand irony about that is that the whole point of the Fed funds market was kind of to lend overnight to help people be compliant with their reserve requirements. But it is currently the case that banks tend to have a giant oversupply of funds on deposit with the Federal Reserve. So you don't need to borrow any of this money because you already have way more than you need because you left it there on purpose.
Why did they do that?
Okay, so by they, do you mean the banks, or by they, do you mean the Fed?
Banks.
The banks.
So why do they have so much money banks?
Why do they have money parked at the Fed?
Right.
The short answer to that question is because it pays interest. It pays good interest.
They're choosing earnings over shareholder dividends.
No, more like this, right? Imagine I'm a commercial bank. I'm a regular old commercial bank, and I have some money, right? And I can lend it to like a local business for 30 days to buy some flour to bake some bread, right, and get some certain percent of my money. or I can just give it to the Federal Reserve, right? How do I choose between those two? Well, it depends on how much risk I'm taking buying the flour, doing the flour loan, versus how much return I get, right? And so the Federal Reserve is paying interest on deposits at the Federal Reserve such that banks are choosing to leave money at the Fed instead of doing small-time commercial lending.
Right. But they can always pull it out of the Fed whenever they want, if they want to do some short-term loans somewhere else, if they become more lucrative.
Correct.
But you also said this was in excess of what they need for reserves.
Right, so historically, the Federal Reserve did not pay any interest on deposits at all, right? Zero. So, of course, right, you want every last penny you can not in that account, right? So you have the absolute legal minimum in that account, and if you're under by $10, you borrow, and if you're over by $10, you kick it out because it's wasted money, right? So historically, that's what it was. Nobody had any money in deposit at the Fed other than the legally mandated minimum, and that's why there was an active market in this overnight stuff to make everybody match up perfectly. And then they would target those rates with their announcement. But when they started paying interest on those reserves, suddenly it made sense to have way more money on deposit at the Federal Reserve than was legally required, minimum. And so then you didn't have to lend and borrow at the Fed funds because you're already way past the requirement. So why mess with an overnight loan because you're already fine. So everybody quit messing with overnight loans. Yeah.
I know the overnight loans are all short-term, just based on nature, but I mean, if you have the reserve and they are continuing to pay these interest rates on these short-term loans, wouldn't that eventually restrict the amount of money that banks are going to be offering to, if I'm a small business owner, potentially, isn't that going to make it harder for me to potentially borrow money if I have this bank that can just keep doing these short-term loans over and over and over again, with the federal government? Won't that negatively impact, or could it have a negative?
No, 100% yes. Like by construction, it has to, right? Like any dollar that's sitting at the Fed collecting interest from the Federal Reserve would have had to have been lent in some other way. Now, it doesn't necessarily turn into a commercial loan, but it's got to do something, right? So it just naturally follows, right? If there's a whole bunch of money landing at the Federal Reserve collecting interest, that money didn't have to go into the real economy doing business stuff or whatever else it was going to do. So yeah, if you can think about a different scenario, what if they crank up that rate really high, where it's like, oh, well, let's throw every last penny into the Federal Reserve account. Well, that means there's not going to be any money left for commercial lending, right? There won't be nobody will be doing any kind of, right? You try to get a loan for your business, there's no money. And say, well, I would lend to you. You're risky. I can just get, right, there's free money over here, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the reality is the rates are not that good, right? They're good enough to draw a lot of money, but they're still, right? And this is, again, the Federal Reserve designs it this way, right? They set the rates that they pay on the deposits that they collect so that they get the right amount of money to serve their purposes. So we'll get into, right, what actually, they have a reason for collecting these deposits over here. But yeah, the deposits they're collecting over here reduces the deposits available for lending to regular businesses. By construction, yeah.
And if they all of a sudden wanted to inject more money into the, potentially into the economy actually doing something, would they all of a sudden decide to lower those rates to kind of force the banks to to take it out?
Exactly, right? When you get the mechanism for that? So all you have to do to inject money into the commercial lending pool is tweak slightly the deposit interest rate. Banks will pull it out, put it into the, into commercial loans. And what would that do, right? A sudden flood of money into commercial lending out of federal deposits would lower interest rates and potentially lead to some inflation, right? If we lean on it hard enough, right? Because you got suddenly there's a bunch of loans chasing a bunch of investment opportunities. So there's a bunch of investment suddenly. Investment leads to spending, leads to inflation, right? So the Federal Reserve could turn on inflation and lower rates simply by dropping those deposit interest rates. Now they don't want inflation, right? The whole point of stability would be like make sure inflation is exactly what we want it to be. right? But they can tune how much inflation they're getting based on the interest they're paying on those deposits. So so rather than thinking, oh, well, they can turn that down and flood the market with dollars, it's more like, well, let's put it exactly where we want it, so that inflation is exactly where we want it, and that's more like what they're doing.
I definitely don't want to get off topic, and I can look, but I mean, you're talking about banks and Federal Reserve and deposits and everything. When they had the economic hardship of 2008 around that time, and you had the big banks, like Chase, that was, accepting a lot of bailout funds from the government to, so they went down. I mean, were there reserves in jeopardy? I mean, some of those banks, or was it just the,
Yeah.
other, I mean,
Right, you could have $40 billion in reserves at the Fed. If you have $50 billion worth of loans that come due, well, yeah, those are invested. You're bankrupt. Yeah, they're in jeopardy, right? Because you're bankrupt, right? So having assets doesn't matter if you have liabilities that are bigger. So absolutely, those deposits were in jeopardy. They're always in jeopardy, right? Because none of these financial institutions have only assets and no liabilities. They're all leveraged to the hilt, right? That's like how that
It wasn't
business
one of the
runs.
primary issues, the valuation of those assets were changed, they were junked, right? There wasn't like the low quality real estate.
Okay, now I have to be careful,
So
right?
it wasn't worth $100, it actually became worth $30, and thus the valuation changed what would have been your calculation for your reserves.
Yes, kind of. So in the world, okay, so for the Federal Reserve, initially they didn't own any of those,
No,
right?
I'm talking
Right.
about the big banks.
But yeah, like a big regular bank would have a bunch of bonds that had loans backing them that were mortgages on residential assets that ultimately, like these mortgages ended up being not worth very much, like you were saying. So then you have a whole bunch of capital, right? Again, with a bank, your assets are the mortgages and your liabilities are the deposits, right? So the fact that somebody's house is underwater doesn't mean they're going to give you a discount on their checking account, right? Like, yeah, like I have like a $4,000 deposit at your bank, but we'll say it's $2,000 because you're taking a hit on my mortgage. Right? That's not how it works, right? If you have $4,000 in deposit with the bank, you expect all that money, right? So their liabilities stayed, but their assets dropped, and that's how you get in like financial hot water. Okay. Now, but I just want to sort of impress upon you the sort of the wackiness of the situation, right? We have this Fed funds rate that gets all the news, right? And it's like targeted by these federal monthly meetings, but nobody's using it, right? They have deposits at the Fed in excess of what they need. Nobody borrows and lends at this rate. So we announce it, we make a bunch of fanfare about what we want it to be, but it's not relevant to anyone. I mean, the only reason there are any Fed funds activity at all at this point is because there are certain federally affiliated entities that are not allowed to have deposits at the Fed, and so they do a little bit of borrowing and lending at the Fed funds rate, but the amount of activity in this rate has declined drastically, right? So the real rate, the one that actually matters for what the Federal Reserve's monetary policy is this interest on excess reserves rate, which they don't talk about at all. You can go find it, but that interest on excess reserves rate and the Fed funds rate are very close to each other, right? So we talk a lot about the Fed funds rate because historically it was important, but in practice it doesn't matter at all. But the announcements still mean a lot because it tells you the Fed's plan for the interest on excess reserves rate, which is the one that actually does stuff these days. So,
Reserves aren't actually held by the Fed, though, right?
yep. You want to see a picture?
Like actual cash.
Mm-hmm. I'm like trillions of dollars, yeah.
I thought it was basically just acting like you have equity.
Yeah.
You actually have to have.
Oh, no, sorry. No. Okay, now we have to be careful. I have to be careful. The have to part is different, right? So the have to part, I don't think is what I'm talking about. There are banks have voluntarily put a ton of money on reserve at the Fed. So they have they have to part, right? They have to meet the reserve requirements, but those reserves don't have to.
Be in their bank.
Correct.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
So yeah, I'm a CPA, so it's really hard for me to separate the actual money from the economic money.
Yeah, you wouldn't call, like, if your kids play Counter-Strike and they get goofy hats from winning fights, you wouldn't call that money if you were doing somebody's accounting. But an economist would tell you 100% that's a currency. It works just fine.
It's a very difficult translation. It's like two different languages.
Yes. All right, we are not going to talk about all this, like, detail. But this, so there's Federal Reserve districts and all this stuff, right? It's in the reading. I'm more interested. I mean, I want to get to the actual.
Jay Powell is what, Federal Reserve.
Yes.
We skipped over.
Oh yeah. Sorry. So we currently So Jay Powell is currently the chairman. Let's. You know what? Let's talk just briefly about the crisis because it's important to understand how this will work. So we'll get into historically. So historically, what the Federal Reserve did, right, was they had the bulk of the assets the Federal Reserve had were long-term U.S. government debt in various denominations. That was pretty much the assets they had, and then liabilities would be basically currency in circulation. And that's sort of like what that looked like. Okay. So starting the financial crisis, that picture started to change. So in 2007. Well, this is when things were starting to heat up. So the short-term loans between commercial entities, like not just banks, like regular, actual industrial companies will borrow for 30-day periods. That's called commercial paper. It's a really great source of cheap financing for large companies. A lot of them are very active in the commercial paper market. But the commercial paper market has this feature where every 8, 10, 12 years or so, the market will just decide it's too dicey, we're not doing this anymore. So basically you do 1-month loans over and over and over and over again for 9 years until you wake up in February and go, oh, nobody is doing this anymore. I can't roll over this big loan I've been rolling over for 8 years. So now I got to come up with a different source of financing. Okay? So this happens every once in a while in the commercial paper market. It's kind of the whole point. It's really safe for investors because they can pull their money out whatever they want, effectively.
And is it literally just a contract? Just a contract between my business and your business?
Yep. So investors, right? So you securitize you have $100 billion of debt that you securitize into individual little packets. And, so you can treat me like I'm Americans and you're the company, and you go, hey, do you want to borrow $100 billion for a month? And I go, or can I borrow $100 billion? And I go, sure.
But we're not doing that directly then. We're doing $100 million through an agent.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's a whole market for these, right? It's like a stock market. There's a whole separate market with agents and individuals and all. But yeah, so kind of what happens, right, is I give you $100 billion, you give it back. And you go, okay, pretty please have it back right away. And I go, sure. So I give back, and then you give it back. And then and you say, can I pretty please have it back? And I go, sure. And I give it back. Right? So we just do this tennis match. So ultimately, you just sort of have this $100 billion loan that's just floating around for years and years and years because every time I say yes, right? Until one day in 2007, you give it to me and you go, can I have it back? And I go, no, not doing it, right? So now you go, shoot, now where am I gonna get this $100 billion from? So what happened is not only were commercial industrial firms doing this kind of lending, but there were also short-term loans backed by packages of mortgages that were doing this transaction, right? And those are the ones that went sideways, right? So these short-term loans collateralized by mortgage debt, that market disappeared. And that was a problem because it was, again, being used to help fund mortgage creation. And so the Federal Reserve stepped in and said, okay, we're going to create a facility, sort of like a loan facility to step in and replace this disappearing activity, right? So you can sort of see the start of this. But things start to go worse in 2008, and so the Federal Reserve starts having to create all these facilities to help step in for markets that are frozen or dried up. And really what happens, right, you can understand if mortgage debt is dying, then you can't trust any assets backed by that, and that means the whole banking system is kind of freezing up because you don't want to lend to anybody because any loans you make could be backed by mortgages that could die on you, right? So things are like freezing up, and so they facilitate a bailout of Bear Stearns. They create a lending facility for these short-term securities, and then this discount window. So the Fed had a discount window where you could just borrow money directly from the Federal Reserve. Okay? Nobody did it. Why? It meant that if you borrowed from them, you couldn't get funding from anywhere else. And if you know banks, the last thing you want to look like is a loser, right? Like you don't want to look like, oh, that's the bank that couldn't actually get a loan, right? They try to look like they're rich all the time, right? So looking like you're desperate is not what banks want to do. And so nobody ever uses the discount window. But if we're in a desperate crisis, then it's not a bad signal to use it because everybody's in trouble, so it doesn't make you look any worse than anyone else to use it. So when things get bad, banks will come out and use this direct loans from the Fed. Well, they expanded it to include these investment banks because they were in big trouble with all of these dying mortgage securities, right? So it's like we're going to expand this special lending window to let other banks in. Lehman collapses. Goldman and Morgan Stanley become commercial banks for safety reasons. Merrill Lynch and Bombay Maker, but basically investment banks that do investing as their main business, were just effectively dead. Like they had to become regular banks in order to survive.
How from like a compliance perspective, how did the valuation of those mortgages get so out of whack to the purchase price?
Yeah. So it's pretty easy how that would happen, right? Because what you do is you would say, okay, I have a $100,000 house and I have $80,000 mortgage, right? Or $90,000 or $95,000 or whatever. And we know historically those default rates are 3%. So you put, and in the case of default, you get your money, you just get it earlier, right? I have a textbook on fixed income valuation, and there's a line right out of that book that default is experienced from the investor as a prepayment. They were all insured, right? So if you've got this portfolio of mortgages, you expect 3% of them to go bad in a certain time frame, and going bad means you get your money back. So bad wasn't even that bad in their world, right? You just get paid early. That's actually not a good thing often because when you reinvest at a lower interest rate. You want to collect a nice fat mortgage payment for 30 years. That's what you want to do, right? So getting the money back isn't necessarily a good thing. But you can understand the lender's perspective, right? If the worst thing that happens is you get your money back, you're not too worried about it, right?
So what went wrong?
So what went wrong is that the insurance policies that paid the money back when the mortgages defaulted went belly up. That was AIG. So AIG was all in on insuring those mortgages, and they couldn't make good on the insurance policy. And historically, it didn't matter anyway. Even if the mortgage wasn't insured, the house was worth more than the mortgage basically every time because...
So both things had to happen.
Right, you had to have the house prices decline below the value of the mortgage, and you had to have the insurer of the mortgage go belly up. And that's why those bonds were triple rated, because it was like, look, this happens 3% of the time at most, and when it does, it's fine.
Is triple rated good or bad?
Triple A rated is the best, sorry, yeah.
Those are the best.
Those are the best, yeah.
And those are the ones that went bad?
Mm-hmm.
The
Because
best.
the mortgages underneath them weren't AAA, but the fact that they were insured and backed by housing collateral made them AAA. Right? Lending to regular people are not AAA, right? We are not AAA rated people. But if we have a house that's worth more than the loan, that's insured by a Fortune 500 company, that package is now very safe.
Well,
Well,
that's like the same thing you talked about earlier with the student loans being AAA, and that's only because there's so many, right? Did you say that those are AAA?
Yeah, the government guarantees
Right.
in case of default, right? I mean, it's sort of the same, that this was all insured. So yeah, so what happened was the property crashed by 50, 60% in some cases, like in Vegas, right? And then the insurer went belly up, and suddenly you had these like securities that had never, like the collateral had never been in negative value like since, I mean, when was the last time housing fell broadly in America? I don't know, 30s, I guess, right? I mean, it's been a long, long time since it's had a broad housing decline. And often, right, those mortgages aren't even, they're not 100% mortgages anyway, right? It's like a 90 or an 80, right? A lot of them are, you know, you lend less than the value. So it was this like historically almost unprecedented that these things end up underwater. And it was insured anyway. So that's how it was AAA.
And how did AIG, I mean, because again, from a compliance perspective, there's all these checks and balances to ensure that that stuff doesn't happen. So how did an insurer end up underwater?
Because they were not technically insuring, they were swapping. So they never promised to insure the mortgages. They promised to give you a federal government debt instead of the mortgage if it went bad. So that was their end. They didn't insure it. They just guaranteed you a trade. So they weren't regulated as an insurer because it was a derivative contract. It was an over-the-counter derivative contract. And so it wasn't insurance, right? But it was, right? So it's basically they took a financial arrangement. They hacked a financial arrangement into an insurance policy so that they wouldn't be regulated as an insurer, so then they could get over their head and make some money. That's what they chose to do. And it killed the business, right? I mean, the whole company. And it wasn't, right? AIG has millions of lines of businesses. It was just like the one little sliver got greedy and went a little crazy. But yeah, so they ended up way underwater. So then you have these portfolios of debt that dropped in value by a ton in a world where it should never drop in value, and that's what sent everything reeling. Because banks, right, they keep a giant pile of AAA rated stuff in the coffers to keep it really safe and boring, right? Banking's supposed to be boring. Your like ultimately safe, uber reliable capital is not supposed to drop by 30%, but it did. So you start to get all these like things happening. And we're creating an asset-backed commercial paper facility. That's those like mortgage-backed ones, right? All of these funding facilities are meant to help these markets limp along. And right, so and like this, look at this. This is like just sends it home. The Federal Reserve lending, where they're lending to organizations, that the weekly lending went from 59 million to 850 billion. So it was more than 1,000 times increase in lending. So it's basically they didn't lend before, and suddenly they were lending a lot, right? Almost $1 trillion a week in late 2008. Right. So that's going to show up on a lot of interesting little pictures of what life was like for the Fed through this time. Right, so this is borrowing, right? So you can see, does anybody borrow from the Federal Reserve? No, right? Nobody's borrowing. And then this huge explosion of borrowing, right? This is direct loans from the Federal Reserve, and then nothing. Right, so think about that in terms of assets. These loans, are these liabilities or assets for the Federal Reserve? Assets. It's so where banking is weird, but right? They've got a ton of assets here because they've lent out money to these institutions, right? So if suddenly they've got a ton of assets, right? There's got to be a corresponding liability. This stuff just doesn't create it out of nowhere, right? So what are the liabilities that match these assets? So that's what we're going to go find. So these funds to lend have to come from somewhere, right? So here we go. This is the picture. So these are assets of the Federal Reserve, starting at this, right? This is like, and this is even post-financial crisis, right? So black is total assets, and you can see the total assets, right? This is $2 trillion, right? So the total assets of the Federal Reserve in 2010 were $2 trillion. In 2017-ish, we're up over like $4.5 trillion. So it's not like the assets have declined, right? They've actually been going up post-financial crisis. And you can see, right, it's almost entirely securities held outright. So So on the right, that's a picture, that's a breakdown of the red part of this graph, right? So there's this little, right? So there's other assets that the Federal Reserve has that are not securities they own, but it's very small, right? This is like not much.
So like what types of securities?
So that's over here. So the types of securities the Federal Reserve owns were initially lots of mortgage-backed securities, right? Some federal agency debt. So federal agencies, those are like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, right? These are the government affiliated private companies that help sponsor mortgage creation, right? So they buy mortgages, package them up, turn them into assets, and then they do loans collateralized by those mortgages, right? My mortgage got bought by Freddie immediately, like within a week of me getting it. So the Fed, initially, right, they had a bunch of mortgage-backed securities, then they got out of it, and then got back into it in a big way. So there's a ton of mortgage-backed securities the Federal Reserve was acquiring in 2013, 2014, and then it tapered off. And then the black is U.S. Treasuries. So they're buying, right? They're buying a bunch of treasuries, and they're buying a bunch of mortgage-backed securities, and selling off some of their Fannie and Freddie debt down to basically nothing, right? So let's think about what that does to interest rates. So what would buying a bunch of U.S. Treasuries and buying a bunch of mortgage-backed securities do to interest rates? Yep, right, again, right, because if I buy them, it drives up the prices of those things, which is going to drive down the interest rates. That's the important thing to remember with debt. High prices means low rates. So anytime we buy, we are lowering interest rates. So this activity is going to lower rates on mortgages. What about this black line? Lower rates on federal government debt. Okay, so the Federal Reserve, since 2010, has taken a bunch of actions to decrease mortgage rates and decrease federal loan interest, right? And to do that, they've been doing open market purchases. Obviously, though, right, if you buy a bunch of stuff, if you have a bunch more assets, you need to have a corresponding liability that goes up as well, right? So that's what's coming next. So what do you think the liabilities are going to be? Like, what kind of liabilities does the Fed have?
It's going to have a deposit somewhere.
Okay, right? So deposits are an asset of the Federal Reserve. What else? What's another liability of the Federal Reserve? There's one other major one. Currency and circulation, right? So do you think that all of these asset purchases were funded by increasing currency and circulation? Did they just print their way into buying all this stuff?
Partially, right?
We'll see in a second. If they actually did, I think you would expect to see massive, massive inflation, right? Which obviously we haven't seen, right? So
Well, I mean, we have in a way. I mean, there was the year around 2008 where all of a sudden, I'm looking at just from perspective of kids, you go out and you buy the Turtle Sandbox, and all of a sudden it went from $50 to $80, and the next year it went back down to $50. So there was like a major inflation period for that 1 year.
Yeah, there's.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yes,
There
yes.
was a major jump in prices, at least for kids' crap, because that's all I was buying at that time. And all of a sudden the next year just went down. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to buy this stupid Sandbox that was half the price last year. It can't stay up there.
Yeah, and I don't know what. I mean, that has to be country specific or region specific or commodity specific sort of stuff. Because broadly, right, inflation has been higher recently, where higher is like 2%, right? I mean, the target was 2, but they never got to the target until recently, and then it's been like 2. But
What's the primary measure of inflation? Is it consumer price index?
yeah, typically we do core CPI. So this is the consumer prices of a basket of goods, excluding energy and homes. That's what they normally do. So Now it's amazing how fast 2% can creep up on you, right? I mean, compared to 1999, if you're doing 2% a year, that's probably 25, 26% increase, right? But so there's the assets, here's the liabilities, right? So this is credit, and you can see it explode and then disappear. And this is like interesting. I don't know what's going on with these little ticks over here. Kind of random, but they're small. This is the liability picture, right?
Yeah, they're small, they're just, 5 times 20 big. 5 times.
Yes. So the increase in U.S. government debt assets and mortgage-backed security assets was funded with what liabilities?
Currency, deposits,
Right. Okay. Now, if you ever go, so look at this, right?
You sold bonds, right, and now you owe that.
Nope.
Owe it back to them.
Nope. Good thought. Good thought. Look at this, right? We have clear spikes here, right? So we have a spike in purchases around 2011 and a spike in purchases around 2013, right? So if we buy a bunch of assets around that time, we need a corresponding spike in liabilities. So let's go look and see what liabilities spiked around that time. So what liabilities spiked around those time periods? Right? Did currency and circulation spike? No, that's like uber boring. Right? It's growing, no doubt, but it's very steady in its growth. Right? Did treasury balance explain it? No? Right? You can see, right? This is exactly. So you get how this works? Right?
But what is, so the deposits are in what form?
Again, remember, these are deposits held at the Federal Reserve from typically large commercial banks.
Right, so this is like what you were talking about earlier, where they put the money in the Federal Reserve to earn interest instead of lending it out to people because it's risky.
well, they weren't gonna
Yep.
put it in bad loans, so put it in
Right.
deposits here.
Yep. And again, right? This is $2.2 trillion sitting there, right? But you can see how this works, right? So from the Federal Reserve, and I go, okay, I want to lower mortgage rates, and I want to lower the cost of borrowing for the federal government, lower the interest rates, and depress the currency a little bit. What do I do? Mechanically. Right? I just had my meeting. This is what I decided to do. I want to lower mortgage rates, and I want to lower interest rates on federal government debt.
So you're gonna raise the rates that you pay out on funds.
Okay, right? So step one, I will raise the rates I pay out on deposits at the Federal Reserve. What is that going to do?
It's gonna lower the loan rates.
Well, it's going to lower the amount of money that the banks are putting into this system.
Yes, but that doesn't affect me directly. You're totally right. But okay, wait. But think about mechanically what happens immediately, right? I raise the interest I'm paying on excess reserves. Immediately, what happens?
Less loans are given out.
Because
They're putting the money in the bank.
right, so I'm the captain of the Federal Reserve steering my wheel, and I look at my bank account and bloop, right? I just managed to get $500-600 billion of deposits in a very short time frame.
And if anybody wants to borrow money, they're gonna have to pay more for it because they gotta compete with this.
Correct. Yes. That's a side effect, but very real and important one. But from the perspective of what I'm trying to do, that's like extra, right? So, but yes. So, okay, so now I have all this money, right, because it got deposited. Now I'm sitting on a giant pile of money. What do I do with that giant pile of money? Again, what are my goals?
Boring.
Boring, stabilize, which in this case means specifically lowering mortgage rates, lowering federal borrowing rates, probably to lower the exchange rate. Okay, so if I want to do those things, right? So those are my goals. That's what I want to do, right? I want to lower mortgage rates and I want to lower federal borrowing costs. I have $600 billion. How do these two talk to each other? How can I use my $600 billion to mess with these? It's very simple. Again, right, you gotta think about it, right? I have $600 billion sitting there. It should do something, right? I collected it for a reason. What am I gonna do with it now?
Give it away to the people.
Right, so the Federal Reserve could create a $30,000 Federal Reserve note and mail it to everybody. Would that accomplish those two objectives? Not really. Right? How do we affect these things specifically?
Well, printing money, but I don't see that in there.
I don't know that printing money would affect mortgage rates, right? Not necessarily. What's the ease? Think about that. I mean, this is important because I guess mechanically, I want you to understand how this world works, right? Mechanically, if I want to make mortgage rates lower, what do I have to do?
You have to make the deposit rates lower. But I thought we just talked about how they went up.
Yeah, so deposit rates won't affect mortgage rates. Okay, we'll do a big reveal, okay? But we gotta understand, and it'll be like, oh, right, once you hear it, okay? We want mortgage rates to be lower, which means we need prices on mortgage packages to be higher. If we want prices on mortgage packages to be higher, we should
Raise them.
we can't raise them, but what we can do is buy them.
So there's less supply and the price goes up.
Yes, right? If I'm bidding them up, or I'm literally buying them, bidding them up, those prices go up, those interest rates come down. Now, can I afford to buy, billions and billions of dollars of mortgages? Do I have billions and millions of dollars?
Yes.
Yes, because I'm going to print it? No,
No,
You could get it on reserve right now.
because I've got a bunch of deposits, right? I got $600 million sitting there because I have my reserves. Everybody get that? Right? So I raised the interest in excess reserves, collect $600 million, spend $200 billion of it buying mortgage-backed securities, which drives up those prices, drives down mortgage rates. Then I take the other $400 billion, and what do I do with that? What was my other goal? I wanted to lower mortgages, and I wanted to
I don't remember.
lower federal borrowing costs. So to lower federal borrowing costs, I'm going to buy something, obviously, right? What should I buy?
Bonds.
Yep. And if I buy Fed bonds, that will drive up the prices of those federal bonds, drive down the interest rates on those bonds, so that when they issue new ones to fund a deficit, they'll issue them at lower interest rates. Right? And that happened twice. Right? Once here in a major way, and once here in a major way. But you can see this is not steady. Right? They're messing with this constantly. And you'll also see it drifts down, right? So we're kind of naturally drifting down as the currency naturally drifts up. We do a big purchase, this naturally drifts down, and this drifts up. Right? And we do a big purchase, and then this drifts down as this drifts up. Right? So we're sort of constantly printing to keep, in effect, to keep inflation where we want it, right? But they're actually doing the monetary policy stuff via the deposit liabilities, which are manipulated via the interest on excess reserves. So it's actually kind of beautiful in the way it all plays out. Like they can mess with this minute by minute, second by second, and make it just perfect, right? But we've already identified the problem, right? You can't just do this forever in the sense that, right? What if we drive this to 7 or 10 or 15 billion dollars? What's going to happen? Right? If we hoover up $15 trillion to be deposits in the Federal Reserve System, what's not happening?
It's not out of circulation.
Right, you can't get a commercial loan to do anything in the United States, right, at that point. So the hidden cost of all of this is that
Or if you do, it's extremely high interest rate.
because you have to compete with these really sweet zero risk Federal Reserve deposits. Right, so what we would experience is difficulty getting commercial loans for regular business stuff. Now, I'm not a business owner, I can't speak to whether, it's harder to get a loan for my business in 2018 than it was in 1995, but that would be a potential side effect of this if we overdid it. And there's another thing, so there's another factor here too, right? What if the government runs up a giant deficit? What does that do? Right? We create a whole bunch of bonds and we do that, right? Because they have to create bonds to fund the operations of the government. So that naturally creates a ton of bonds, right? So if we create a ton of bonds, what is that going to do to the price of those bonds? They're going to go down, right? Because we have now a huge supply rather than a huge demand. When the prices, when bond prices go down, what happens to interest rates?
They go down too.
Oh, right again, right? Opposite. So when prices are down, rates are up. So when the government runs up deficits, it inherently, naturally increases interest rates, which is a drag on the economy, right? Simultaneously, it creates a bunch of dollar-denominated assets, which leads to inflation, right? Budget deficits are one of the major predictors for inflation. So running up huge deficits sort of gets you this double problem where you're causing inflation at the same time that you're raising interest rates, because the tool they use to cancel inflation is raising the interest rate. So deficits basically do the opposite of what the Federal Reserve wants to do in general. And so to some degree they have to kind of clean up the mess of the Treasury, right? If the Treasury runs up a huge deficit, they have to hidey-hole a bunch of that debt away. So a lot of these federal asset purchases, right, would cancel out some of the deficits that were run up in those times.
So what is the impact of the debt ceiling?
Totally irrelevant to this, basically. So the debt ceiling, again, so remember, this is a private organization in charge of our currency. The debt ceiling is a congressional limit, right? So the only degree they would talk is if the debt ceiling managed to inflict some kind of fiscal discipline that would reduce the deficit, which would reduce the demand for buying up Treasury securities using deposits as liabilities. Now, that debt ceiling doesn't appear to do that at all, since the money already got spent anyway, but, so yeah. It's really weird, right? That basically the federal government does its own money stuff, and then the Federal Reserve sort of takes that as given and plays with stuff. But yeah, basically the Federal Reserve does different things than it did historically. This is all different. The interest and excess reserves thing didn't start until like 2006. This is fairly new, this whole arrangement. So it's a very different world. I mean, so this is just, you can see this is check clearing, right? And there are, right, you can see paper checks declining, ACH transactions exploding. And you probably, have you done ACH in your life? Where you give a website your checking account routing number and they just pull money out of it? That system is created by the Fed and has exploded in relevance, and paper checks are on the decline. And let's see, this is the balance sheet. You can see these massive changes, right? So in terms of assets, there's there's not a huge change in assets other than, right, Treasury securities are up 142%, and miscellaneous assets are up 400%. So that's a pretty big difference. But you get to the liability side, and that's where things just go really crazy, right? We have depository reserves from 2007 to 2013 increased basically 5,000%. So it's just a hugely different world. A lot of these are up over 1,000%. So yeah, at the end of the day, they are serving a different role than they did in the past. Okay, well, should we do this? Any other concluding thoughts about the Fed? It's, right, they're kind of sitting in the background. We talk about numbers that move the world. The Fed funds rate is probably the number one number that fits that description, right? Every once in a month they announce a number, and it changes the global financial landscape, like for literally everybody on the planet, right? If they say we're moving it, or if they say we're not going to move it, everything's different. So there's a lot of power there, but in general, it's power wielded in the interest of boring. Right? Like we have all these levers and we can do crazy stuff, and our goal is to make things as stable and uninteresting and smooth as possible. Yeah.
Okay, so it was, I believe it was still when Ben Bernanke was the head of that, where he was like buying or flooding the market with money. Is that what he was doing, was buying bonds?
Yes.
And then it like trickled down to a point where they stopped doing it. And it seemed like that's when Janet Yellen took over.
Yeah. So those
he
spikes.
was just buying the bonds during that time frame
Correct.
because it was like some massive amount. It was like 800 million or 800 billion or something like that.
Well, you saw, right? It was
On
trillions.
basis.
It went from 2 trillion to 4.5 trillion over that time period. Those like, we saw those two, like, you saw it sort of spiked and then flattened and then spiked and then flattened. That was QE2 and QE3, like they call them quantitative easing.
Yes.
Those spikes are quantitative. That's what it was those asset purchases. So inflating the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve in order to, create these outcomes we want twice. And they announced the end of it, and that's when it went flat. And then they'd say, oh, okay, we're going to do a new round, and then it would go up again. So, yeah.
I just remember toward the end of the second one, it felt like he prolonged it too long.
Yeah, I don't know. If that was true, what would show up? Right? If we did too much quantitative easing, then you would see low interest rates for too long, which would lead to, I guess, asset bubbles or something. Too long is a bit of an opinion without some kind of observable negative consequence of doing it for too long. It's the same thing with Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan kept us at a low interest rate environment for a long time, and so people blame the housing bubble on that, right? It was like, well, rates were so low, so mortgages were so low, so house prices went nuts, and we were in a good economy. We didn't need to keep it low for that long. So in that sense, the too long thing could get pointed at Greenspan and then lead to the housing crisis. But I'm not, it's hard to point at the thing in Bernanke land where you go, oh, well, he left it on too long and then we got bubble X. Maybe the stock market, right? So maybe you would say, oh, well, he caused the stock market bubble. I don't know.
Okay.
Yep. It's tough to sit on the outside and say, oh, that was too long or too short or whatever. But you're right. I remember people talking about it.
Nobody
Yeah.
says the stock market's out of control because they like it high, but at the same time, it's historically high,
Yep.
especially over the last 2 to 3 years.
Yep. Yeah, and especially in terms of dollars per dollar of earnings, it's historically quite high.
That's what's confusing about when you say the bond market over the last 30 years has had this awesome performance. Like, it's hard to imagine that with the valuation of the stock market.
No, and this is important, right? So the bond market, right? If I put $1 in the bond market versus $1 in the stock market dollar would have done a lot better. But on a risk-adjusted basis, the bond market would have been a much better investment, right? In terms of like return over standard deviation, for example.
Risk adjusted is irrelevant if you look over the value of a dollar over that 30-year time frame, right?
Yeah, and so okay. So
it was risky, but you still made more money.
kind of, right? So here's the deal, right? If you know you're investing for 30 years, there has never been a time in the history of like Western civilization when the stock market has underperformed the bond market over 30 years.
Right.
unless you were like invaded by Russia and became communist and it all went away anyway.
Could happen.
It could, right? But absent a disaster of that kind of scale, it's never been the case that the stock market has underperformed the bond market, which basically means that's not a fair comparison, where you have to use like a 10-year horizon or a 5-year horizon or something where they actually like compete with each other. And in that case, right, over those shorter horizons, the bond market was just a much, right, in terms of risk reward ratio, was just like way better over that time frame. Quantifying risk is like, I mean, it's a quest of a millennium, right? It's not easy to do because it changes depending on your time frame for one. But basically, using in the current state of the art of risk measurement, the risk-adjusted performance of the bond market was much better over that time frame, even though the stocks did well. They just also bombed a couple times. It's sort of like enough chaos makes it not worth it in a sense,
But at the end of 30 years, it was still more money.
which is
The
always true.
returns are still better.
Yes. So yes, that's like, I mean, so I went to a talk where these guys got the exact same returns as hedge funds, not using hedge funds. They just got them in a different order, but order matters, because if you get money when the economy is terrible and lose money when the economy is great, that's a lot better than losing it when it's horrible and getting when it's great. Because like all along the way, you have these great opportunities if you do it in a different order.
And even for the stock market, isn't that the typical investor? The typical investor likes, you want to buy it when like everything is going up, but in reality, you should be buying when it's.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Like you want to be sitting on a giant pile of money when the things just got beat up horribly, because then everything's on sale.
Right.
But the truth is, usually when everything's on sale, you just lost your shirt with everyone else. So you don't have any more money to invest than anybody else does, because you were in the market with them getting beat up. So,
Unless you're injecting new money.
right, unless you sat out or whatever. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So here we go. Pause.